Joe, we're going to have new inflation numbers coming out next week. What do you see?
Well, two things on this. Number one, we've seen the annualized inflation rate diminish somewhat, but that inflation rate that we've been seeing the last few months is still twice the rate that we've experienced historically. Second of all, even as that inflation rate has come down somewhat, that does nothing to eliminate the real pay cut that we've seen over the last 2 years. It's like, okay, we're going to slash your pay by $5,000 annually, but next month we're going to give you a reprieve. We're not going to cut it any further. Well, families are still, even if inflation went back to 2% tomorrow, which it's not, even if that were the case, families are still suffering from a $400 plus monthly pay cut the past 2 years. Now, looking forward to next month's number, I do think we're going to end up seeing an uptick in inflation. And that's because energy costs, which actually have been coming down somewhat, actually surged over the summer. We saw average oil prices up around 10% in the month of August. And that makes up about 10% of the entire basket of goods and services that we look at for the CPI, for the inflation number. So I think that's going to add about 0.5 percentage point to the monthly inflation rate. And this month, we've seen oil prices increase almost 10% already. And we're not even 2 weeks into the month of September. So I do believe we're going to see inflation numbers heating up once again. And despite the Biden victory lap, we got to remember, even the somewhat lower inflation rate of the past few months is still double the typical inflation that we've seen over the past few decades.
Well, Joe, that's the gaslighting that goes on, right? They're going to come out and say, well, inflation has gone down dramatically. Well, gone down from what? From an all-time high that they caused. I got 2.5 minutes. Trump wins. He calls you up, says, Joe, give me the top 3 things I can do to get inflation under control in the next 6 months. What would it be? You got 2 minutes.
Oh, that's a great question. Well, getting inflation under control will take long-term tough political choices. We need to recognize that what we've seen the past 2 years, at the highest inflation in 40 years, this was caused not just by the Democrats, but it was also caused by Republicans who joined with them to grossly expand the size of government. If you go back, looking to the COVID era, these multi-trillion-dollar spending packages were passed with bipartisan consensus. And this was awful economic policy. And when you see the Federal Reserve printing the money to fund those government operations, we know that at the end of the day, it will spark inflation. Now, that impact was delayed by about a year because much of the economy was shuttered. But we saw the spark that was lit by both Democrats and Republicans. It exploded the past 2 years. And of course, President Biden has been even worse on this. And the Democrats in Congress have been pushing for even more of this inflationary spending. So number one, we have to recognize what caused this problem in the first place. And if President Trump were to win, then he would need to, I would hope, work with his counterparts in Congress to actually pass long-term government spending reforms. Because if we didn't like the inflation of this past 2.5 years that was exacerbated by trillions of dollars worth of pandemic spending, well, guess what? It's going to be far, far worse in the decades to come because we have entitlement programs that haven't been addressed. We have other spending that hasn't been addressed. And these are just on a runway to blow up federal spending even more. The Congressional Budget Office, which actually is nonpartisan, has been warning of this for decades. If you look at a trajectory of government debt to GDP, it's expected to nearly double over the coming decades.